So who can ever be tired of Bath? Well, maybe Jane Austen. Two of her famous books are partly set here, and all of them mention it, so give this ancient city even more fame. But Jane had a complex relationship with the place that has become synonymous with her work. Jane Austen lived in Bath between 1801 and 1806, a fashionable and important place to be if one enjoyed a thriving social life, or if your health needed improving by the ancient water. Jane's time in Bath wasn't always as positive as we may believe, and was either too depressed to write or was far too busy at social occasions. So despite her novels giving Bath more fame, she didn't write any whilst actually here. Despite the fact that she wrote anonymously during her life, with only 6 books published, her fame and influence has been huge through history, being dubbed by many as a good historical source for the lives of the gentry in Regency England. We'll be exploring this wonderful city that Jane once called home.
Before we can explore Jane's life in Bath, we need to look at her upbringing. So let's start the story here outside of St Swithin's Church in Bath, where Jane's parents got married on the 26th of April 1764. Jane was one of 8 children and she was the 7th born on the 16th of December 1775. To find out more about Jane's childhood, we're going to speak to expert Dr Lizzie Rogers.
Hi, I'm Dr Lizzie Rogers and I'm a historian of women's lives in the 18th and early 19th century and historic houses, learning and collecting, and a little bit of Jane Austen.
Well, it's great to be here with you to ask you some questions. So, what was Jane's childhood like?
So by all accounts, Jane had a pretty idyllic childhood. She grew up at Steventon in Hampshire, so not too far from Bath. And she was one of 8 children, one of only 2 girls, and her sister Cassandra was her best friend. She spent a lot of time with her life revolving around Steventon. Her father was a rector at the parish there, the Reverend George Austen, and he also had a great library. The Austens really encouraged their children to read, to act things out, so all of them together would spend their times kind of with cultural pursuits, writing, literary endeavours. So by all accounts, she had a pretty charming childhood, and her nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, published a memoir about 50 years after Jane died, and he said in it that Steventon was the cradle of her genius. So it's hard not to think of it as this beautiful kind of idyllic time where her and her siblings were kind of running around with lots of freedom to learn, to write, and do all these things together.
Well, it sounds like a pretty amazing childhood, especially considering sometimes we think of the past as a bit dingy and horrible. Yes. So it sounds like quite a nice one. So what was her relationship with her family like?
So by all accounts, it was pretty good. I think she really looked up to her father. I mean, he had a library of around 300 books, which she used a lot and really engaged with. Her sister was her best friend, so really out of all her siblings, her sister was the one that she was really, really close to, Cassandra, and they ended up living together pretty much for the rest of their lives. Her favourite brother supposedly was her brother Henry, and he helped her get published, so he was really, really integral to her life. But by all accounts, she got on with all of them. So I think the Austens probably had their family squabbles like anybody and their upheaval, but I think they were pretty close-knit as a family, and she spent her time travelling to visit all of them as an adult as well.
Yeah, I think the fact there was 8 of them, they probably did spend a large portion of the time arguing.
Oh, there must have been squabbles.
But it all resolved in the end. They didn't fall out entirely. So what was Jane's schooling like?
So Jane actually, we'd probably be surprised to know, didn't spend much time at school at all. So she first went to school in 1783. She was only 7 years old. She went with her sister Cassandra, who was 10. And apparently it was well known amongst their family that Jane and Cassandra did everything together. And there's this famous line that says that if Cassandra was going to have her head cut off, Jane would do it too. So that's why they went to school together. They went with their cousin Jane Cooper. And actually, all 3 of them got really ill at school. They ended up with something that we think now might have been typhus. And then when their parents found out, they were pulled back home, of course. They recovered, and then they were sent back to the Abbey boarding school in Reading from 1785 to 87. So actually it's really not that long at school, but her father did tutor local boys who were from well-off families, and Jane benefited from this because he had a great library. She could sit in on some of the lessons and things like that. So her education was really well expanded even outside her attending traditional school.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like a lot of, especially females at this time, didn't actually ever go to school, but they still managed to
be
Completely.
successful, which is, I always find that shocking because I feel like I learned everything at school.
I know, me too. And I think what's really fascinating as well is that a lot of girls in this time were taught, if they're a particular part of society, were taught by governesses, by tutors, by kind of different masters for different subjects. But they were effectively prepared to be accomplished, so they were taught languages, music, embroidery, things like that. Basically things to make them run a household and also be admirable. But at the same time, we do these women a disservice when we say that those things are solely to attract a husband and things like that, because actually they're a gateway into learning more about the world, like reading, having access to a library, collecting things, learning about the world around them. Actually, a lot of them are really engaged with these different things, just in a very different way to men who went to formal school and university.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And like today, when we say that they just learnt some languages, actually that's a really key skill today that a lot of people don't even learn at school. So it's really interesting.
I know.
And so where did her love of literature come from then?
So I think we can very much date that back to Steventon. She grew up in a family who really valued reading. They were members of lending libraries. As I mentioned, her father had this great library of at least 300 books, and she was allowed kind of unfettered access to that. So all of them could dip in and out. They could choose titles they were interested in. They wrote things based off them. She wrote a lot of things when she was younger, some really crazy dramatic things which are really wonderful, that she dedicates to family members. And we can see kind of the influence of different things coming in. Her favourite authors were included Frances Burney, and when she was younger she was listed on the subscriber list, so kind of like crowdfunding, publishing a book to Frances Burney's Cecilia, which I think is a really wonderful thing because it kind of takes you up to where she was reading and where she was getting her ideas from, and it all kind of comes from this period in her life.
So you mentioned that she started writing at quite an early age.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of examples or any writings about what she did at this early age?
Yes, so first of all, she wrote a really great short story called The Beautiful Cassandra, which she dedicated to her sister, and it's got this beautiful dedication where she calls her a phoenix. I mean, I would love it if somebody called me that in a dedication. But her and Cassandra, their interests converged, and they actually wrote, when they were a little bit older, this history of England together, and it parodied a book by Oliver Goldsmith, which is what every child at this time learned history from. And she subtitles it by a partial, prejudiced and ignorant historian. It says something like there are very few facts in this history. And so she goes through all these different monarchs and kind of writes these witty stories of their lives, and then Cassandra illustrates them for her, so they write this history together, and it's really entertaining to read. It's not very historical, but it's really entertaining, and it shows that kind of that genius coming through, and that way she kind of observed people's characters and how she applies it to all these things she's learned. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, and it sounds like they're quite a talented family then, with Cassandra illustrating and I guess Henry helping publish her books. They're quite a well accomplished.
They are, and two of her brothers ended up doing a literary magazine as well while they were at university, and supposedly they say that Jane had something published in that. I don't know how true that is, but it could well have been her first piece in print if it was her, which I think is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, thank you.
Despite the fact that Jane Austen wrote some of the best and most famous romantic novels of all time, she herself never married. She had a brief affair with Palme Lefroy, which ended with no proposal. In 1801, Jane's father retired from his position in Steventon, Hampshire, and moved the whole family to Bath.
The first place that Jane lived while in Bath was 4 Sydney Place, and they moved multiple times before finally relocating just down there at 25 Gay Street after the passing of her father in 1805. She lived here with her mother, sister and an extra lodger. Information on Jane's personal life comes from letters or sketches written by her family members, but only 160 of the 3,000 letters she wrote to her sister Cassandra still survive, because Cassandra burned them so that people couldn't read the information in them. She didn't want any of her younger nieces to read the sometimes acid or forthright opinions Jane had on her neighbours or family members. But in other letters she wrote to Cassandra about going around the Royal Crescent for some fresh air, or about how great Sally Lunn's buns were. From 1801 to 1806, Jane's time in Bath, there's not many stories known about her personal life, apart from her one proposal of marriage in 1802. It came from Harris Bigwither, but it only lasted a day, because despite the advantages it would offer Jane and her family, she decided to call it off. Harris was described as not very attractive, a man of few words, and one that would be difficult to like, let alone love. But there's no accounts of Jane's feelings towards the proposal, apart from a letter she sent to her niece, who was in a similar situation. She told her, "Do not commit yourself further, or think of accepting him, lest you really do like him. For anything is to be preferred or endured, rather than marrying without affection." So maybe Jane decided that that's not the way she wanted to live her life, and that's why she rejected the proposal. Reminiscent of Lizzie Bennet, right? The first biography of Jane's life appeared in the posthumously published Northanger Abbey in 1818, written by her brother Henry, who left a biographical notice at the start of the book. And then the story became embellished by her nephew in 1869, who wrote a memoir of Jane Austen.
Jane Austen published 6 novels in her lifetime, with 2 being published posthumously, and 1 novel, Sandington, remaining unfinished before her death because she was too ill and weak to hold a pen. It was her brother Henry who helped to negotiate deals with publishers. Jane Austen's first novel, Sense and Sensibility, was published in 1811. It was originally called Eleanor and Marianne, and she began writing it as early as 1795. In 1813, arguably Jane's most famous novel, Pride and Prejudice, was released in 1813, and she began writing this one in 1796. All of Jane's work was published anonymously, with it just saying on the cover that it was written by a lady. In 1814, Mansfield Park was released, and in 1816, Emma was published. Her books Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, both released in 1818, were published after her death. Northanger Abbey was originally called Susan, and Persuasion was written between 1815 and 1816. Persuasion and Northanger Abbey are 2 of Jane's books that are partially set in Bath, but all of Jane's books mention the city. Persuasion follows the rekindling of a romance between Anne Elliot and Captain Frederick Wentworth after his return from the Napoleonic Wars. In the last 9 chapters of the book, the family have to relocate to Bath and rent out their home in Kellage. In Persuasion, when Anne sees Captain Wentworth again after he's been away, she sees him in Milson Street. Mr. Elliot was attending his 2 cousins and Mrs. Clay. They were in Milson Street. It began to rain, not much but enough to make shelter desirable for women, and quite enough to make it very desirable for Miss Elliot to have the advantage of being conveyed home in Lady Dampire's carriage, which was seen waiting at a little distance. She, Anne and Mrs. Clay therefore turned into Mullins, while Mr. Elliot stepped to Lady Dampire to request her assistance. She then sees him again, and it was fixed accordingly so that Mrs. Clay should be of the party in the carriage, and they had just reached this point when Anne, as she sat near the window, descried most decidedly and distinctly Captain Wentworth walking down the street. Her start was perceptible only to herself, but she instantly felt that she was the greatest simpleton in the world, the most unaccountable and absurd. For a few minutes she saw nothing before her, it was all confusion. She was lost, and when she had scolded back her senses, she found the others still waiting for the carriage, and Mr. Elliot, always obliging, just setting off for Union Street on a commission of Mrs. Clay's. In Persuasion, the characters reunite on Union Street. They were in Union Street when a quicker step behind, as something of familiar sound gave her 2 moments' preparation for the sight of Captain Wentworth. He joined them, but as if irresolute whether to join or to pass on, and nothing, only looked. Anne could command herself enough to receive that look, and not repulsively. The cheeks which had been pale now glowed, and the movements which had hesitated were decided. He walked by her side. Presently struck by a sudden thought, Charles said, "Captain Wentworth, which way are you going? Only to Gay Street or farther up the town?" "Which is this way." In Northanger Abbey, our heroine visits Bath, and it seems to be based on Jane's first impressions of the city. Jane started writing Northanger Abbey in 1798, and she had visited Bath the year before. The pump rooms were an important social venue in Bath, and our heroine Catherine mentions it in Northanger Abbey. Every morning now brought its regular duties. Shops were to be visited, some new part of town to be looked at, and the pump room to be attended, where they paraded up and down for an hour, looking at everybody and speaking to no one. then wish of a numerous acquaintance in Bath was still uppermost with Mrs. Allen, and she repeated it after every fresh proof, which every morning brought her knowing nobody at all. They made their appearance in the lower rooms, and here fortune was more favourable to our heroine. With more than usual eagerness did Catherine hasten to the pump room the next day, secure within herself of seeing Mr. Tilney there before the morning were over, and ready to meet him with a smile. But no smile was demanded. Mr. Tilney did not appear. Every creature in Bath, except himself, was to be seen in the room at different periods of the fashionable hours. Crowds of people were every moment passing in and out, up to the steps and down, people whom nobody cared about and nobody wanted to see. He only was absent. "What a delightful place Bath is," said Mrs. Allen as they sat down near the great clock, after parading the room till they were tired. "And how pleasant it would be if we had any acquaintances here." Catherine's resolution of endeavouring to meet Miss Tilney again continued in full force the next morning. Until the usual moment of going to the pump room, she felt some alarm from the dread of a second prevention. But nothing of that kind occurred. No visitors appeared to delay them, and they all three set off in good time for the pump room, where the ordinary course of events and conversation took place. Mr. Allen, after drinking his glass of water, joined some gentlemen to talk over the politics of the day and compare the accounts of their newspapers, and the ladies walked about together, noticing every new face and almost every new bonnet in the room. But first, let's get an insight from an expert. Izzy Meakin is a Jane Austen expert and host of What the Austen podcast, so let's go chat to her now.
So I'm Izzy Meakin, and I have a podcast called What the Austen, where I talk about all things Jane Austen, but in particular about her characters and her plots. I also have a YouTube channel where I talk about the same things.
So it's great to speak with you today, Izzy. So how did Bath inspire Jane Austen?
So Jane Austen lived in Bath between 1801 and 1806. And this was during a time when Bath was very much at its peak of its prominence. So it was known for its fashionable society and also vibrant social scene. It was second only to London. So you can imagine it was an incredibly popular city at the time. And compared to London, it also had the benefit of being a spa city as well, so a spa town. So people went not only to socialize, but for their health as well. So this actually was ideal for Austen because she excelled in observing people around her. And this is how she crafted her characters, actually. So she would observe those around her and she would take universal traits that remain present today, and that's how she built her characters and stories. So Bath provided the perfect inspiration for this because so many people across the whole of the country would flock there for the social scene. And then out of this, what we get is two novels. So she wrote Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, and both feature Bath heavily and in detail, and they were both published together after her death. It's kind of widely thought that Jane Austen didn't like Bath as a city when she lived there, but I actually think her relationship with the city is much more complicated than that. I think when she arrived, she probably was extremely excited and felt similar to, how Catherine Morland did. There's a quote at the start of Northanger where Catherine is entering Bath for the first time, and it says, her eyes were here, there, and everywhere. And she's really absorbing everything that's going on around her, and she's so excited to be in the city. And I think for Austen, she probably felt very similar when she first arrived. But unfortunately, in 1805, her father actually passed away. And what we know from her letters and also what a lot of historians have written about Jane is she was incredibly close with her father. And he also was a massive supporter of women having an education, including Jane and her sister Cassandra. So he was probably a massive advocate of her creative pursuits as well. And so losing her father was probably, a massive loss for her. And it also meant the year following, because they were in Bath for another year. Her mother, her sister Cassandra, and Jane, their living conditions would have reduced significantly. And so I can imagine from being incredibly comfortable to then living in more distressing circumstances would have been incredibly difficult. So I think her relationship with the city is more complicated than just a complete dislike, but it definitely holds a lot of different memories for Jane Austen. And I think we see that reflected in her books as well. So Northanger Abbey is very much a coming of age novel. We see it almost from the eyes when she first arrived. And then Persuasion's a much more somber book. So I think that reflects her more complicated and grief-ridden feelings towards Bath.
Kind of touch on it, but with the novels that she wrote, do you want to just chat a bit more about how those are kind of Bath as a key location in those novels?
Yeah, absolutely. So Northanger Abbey was actually started before Jane Austen ever moved to Bath. So she started Northanger Abbey when she still lived in Steventon, and it was originally called Susan, not even Northanger Abbey. However, it is known that Austen sent Northanger Abbey to a publisher in 1803. It was never actually published at this point. But that time period, 1803, falls right in the middle of when she was in Bath. And so I think it's quite easy to assume that a lot of the additions to Northanger Abbey, which focuses heavily on Bath, these were all made much later. So it seems that that book changed significantly and became, and its main location became Bath when she did these rewrites. So that book obviously changed quite significantly. And then Persuasion being the last book that we know that she was actually writing this when she was dying, also heavily focuses on Bath, which I think also showcases that this city was important to her. The fact that she still includes it in one of her last pieces of work, even though she'd lived in Chawton for many years, and then Winchester since the point of leaving Bath, I think it shows that this city did have a special place in her heart. And she did include it in her last book. And I think a lot of the reason why people think that Jane Austen disliked Bath is because Anne Elliot, the main character in Persuasion, she doesn't like Bath very much. And so I think people sometimes get that confused. But I think what's amazing about Northanger Abbey and Persuasion is the references that she makes to Bath. This is someone who has a real intimate knowledge of the city. It's very clear that she was a resident of Bath and a resident for many years because of the locations that she includes. So obviously she uses the prominent locations such as the assembly rooms, the pump rooms, the Real Crescent, the ones that most people already know. But she also uses lesser known locations such as Westgate Buildings, which is where Mrs. Smith in Persuasion lives, and also Gay Street, which not only is where she houses the Crofts in Persuasion, but it's also where Jane Austen herself lived and is also where you find Jane Austen Centre now. So yeah, she uses a lot of these locations in quite an interesting way. One, I think, to highlight that she knows the city well. So anyone who visits Bath, who was reading her works at the time, these books would be so relatable because they're going to places that they will also have been going to. But also, I think it's used in a way to demonstrate how the social status was working at the time. So Bath, in a very interesting way, becomes a bit of a hub to emphasize the status of what was happening in the early 19th century in England, and so it kind of represents this hierarchy, and we see that in Austen's work based off the locations that she mentions and who lives at which locations, because Bath was very much about where you're seen and who you're seen with. Bath kind of works as this hub which really amplifies and kind of isolates what was going on in the wider state of the country, so in England across the board. So obviously status and appearance being incredibly important, and as I was saying, the locations that she mentions really highlights people's status within the book, but also within real life as well. And so and people also, as I was saying, would flock to Bath for the marriage market. So if you were somebody and you were looking for a husband, very similar to Catherine Morland, who is from a small town, like she doesn't have the opportunities to meet everyone. There's a funny passage at the start of the novel where it is saying, there were no men in her town. There was nobody that she could possibly marry. And so that is actually why the Allens do take her to Bath to try and provide her that opportunity. So the great thing about cities like Bath and London is you would go for a season and you could expose yourself and you could be seen, and you could obviously, hopefully, find a partner. That's really why people would go to these towns. And what's great about it as well is Bath would have attracted people of all different age ranges because of the health side. You would have had people who were maybe older and kind of struggling with their health. And then you would have had the younger people who were there for the marriage market. And I think we really see that showcased with Catherine and Isabella Thorpe, as they are going around, they're walking the pump room, they want to be seen, and they are both looking for husbands. But essentially also with Anne Elliot, you know, this is someone who, for all intents and purposes, is considered a spinster by the time the book starts. However, when she comes to Bath, her whole life opens up again. So many more opportunities come for her in terms of like marriage. And I actually think at that point in the novel, Anne actually realizes that herself, that there's still hope for her, that she could still marry. And obviously, in the end, she does manage to marry the man that she's loved for many years. I think what's also something that's good to reference, particularly in Northanger Abbey, which is set heavily in Bath, is what this reflects about the reading habits at the time. So during the like early 19th century, Gothic literature was super popular. And obviously that is a main theme in Northanger Abbey. It is a satire of it, but mostly it's a satire to the notion around Gothic literature. So the people who were reading Gothic literature were mostly young women. And there was this idea that was put out there that it was making young women impressionable, that it was causing them to have unrealistic expectations of the world and making them silly, quote unquote, silly. And so what's amazing about Northanger Abbey is Austen uses it as a way to kind of make fun at that idea by having a character who very much falls into that. But also she uses it as a way to have a commentary on and a commentary and a defense of the novel, which is obviously her preferred medium. It's the written form that she chooses. And she promotes heavily a lot of other women authors in that book as well. And there's something really interesting about this tie between Gothic literature and reading habits at the time. Is it was almost a circle of support for women, that it was a lot of women writing these books. It was women reading these books. And what these novels offered was a form of escapism for them. So not only obviously in the text itself, but because women were supporting other women, like Austen promoting Anne Radcliffe's work and Eliza Parsons' work, it created like a space where women had kind of the closest form of freedom probably that they had at the time. And another way this was shown is how popular circulating libraries were at the time. And these were actually places where women would go and socialize because they weren't invited to a lot of the places that men were. Libraries became kind of these like safe havens for women where they could go and socialize with other like-minded readers. So I think that's also pretty interesting. And I think in general, the fact that these two books are published together, I think is really important because I think they showcase two things that were really important to Austen, maybe even the two messages she really wanted to emphasize. One is the importance of the novel as a literary form, and the other is, you know, marrying for love and why you should hold out hope for that.
Jane's works give us an insight into the lifestyle of the gentry of 18th century England. Her themes of marriage, class and gender show us what it was like to be a woman at a time of rigid social expectations and the power struggle between the sexes. She often offers a satirical commentary on the social cultures of the time, and over 200 years since she began writing, is still one of the most famous figures in literature.